Is everyone in settled down and ready to hear the rest of the program? Well, I am too, because it's a pretty exciting program. We have a great guest speaker from Oakmont who's going to be talking to us, Joe Black. But before we go and get Joe up on the stage, I'd like to, in fact, to make you aware that on the back left-hand table, there's a bunch of sign-ups for various events that we tried to coordinate. We did one on genealogy that Peggy Dumbeck actually took that group and did it via the genealogy program in Oakmont. And so that one is gone. I need people to step up and take the lead on some of the other ones, from hiking to challah making to Yiddish, speaking modern Hebrew. It's a bunch of different subjects up there that you may be interested in, and we'll try to see if we can get the other groups going. As you're aware, today's program is Jews on Broadway, but we have some very interesting programs that'll be coming up in the coming months. One is about the Holocaust. Now, when I think of the Holocaust, I always think of something black and you know, it has images of concentration camps, of destruction, and things like that. But our speaker is a past resident of Oakmont, and he's going to be talking about the positive side of the Holocaust. And I didn't think, is there a positive side of the Holocaust? Well, you'll hear about it when he comes to speak to us. Another speaker, another interesting program, is going to be Jewish Heroes of the American Revolution. So that'll be forthcoming also. Also, we'll have a return guest speaker. Rabbi Gittleman will be talking about end-of-life issues. So those are the ones that are coming up in the near future, and we hope to have all of you return for hear those particular speakers. So let me introduce our guest speaker, Joe Black. Many of you read the bio on the Oakmont News, but I'm going to read it to you again. We are very excited to have Joe Black, an Oakmont resident who is a talented playwright and currently working on a new musical dealing with the Vasa, a Swedish warship built between 1626 and 1628. The ships sank roughly after sailing 140 yards, not that very far, on her maiden voyage on August the 10th, 1628. Joe Black is a semi-retired producer, director, and partner of a New York West End and regional theater shows, pilot TVs, and specials, plus patented videos to help children learn to read and write. He also serves as a play doctor. With his wonderful wife, Sandy, their shows have been nominated for 51 Tony, Drama Desk, Oliver, and other awards, winning 16, including Best Musical in London and Best Revival of a Musical on Broadway. In his spare time, Joe is a gardener, godfather, real estate developer, theoretical astronomer. I've got to find out what that's about. And the creator of new musicals. His current project is Born to the Sea, romantic stories about the Vasa ship in the 16th and 20th century Sweden. So without any further ado, let's hear from Joe Black.
Thank you very much, Howard. It's a pleasure to be here. There. Okay, it's all yours. And there's the mic. So I know a few of you, and
You're okay. You're okay.
All righty. Can you hear that? Okay. Just do a little of that. So now you can hear. Is that too loud for everybody? No, it's not too loud. Okay, that's interesting. It sounds very loud to me because I'm hearing it in here and out there and in here. So I know some of you happily and so glad you're here. We just about have a full house, so we're probably going to break even on this on this show. I gave you all a piece of paper. Most of you have a piece of paper. You got a piece of paper, Jim? Okay, Stephen, I definitely need your help here. Susan, need your help here. Howard, others, I want you to find a pencil or a piece of some blood or some ink or something, and write down all your favorite shows, especially shows that you either saw on Broadway or came from Broadway, plays, musicals. After you've written down some of your favorite shows, you want to write, please, your favorite stars. And after you've written down your favorite stars, maybe your favorite composer or lyricist or choreographer or librettist or stage manager or whatever you can think of. Especially, you write them down, I guarantee you most of them are going to be Jews. But I was telling someone the other day that the speech would be a little shorter if it were about non-Jews on Broadway. Broadway is now about 30 miles long, stretches from the foot of Manhattan to Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow. Anybody ever been to Sleepy Hollow? Sure, all right, we got some Sleepy Hollow fans here. So Broadway was an Indian trail, and it runs just basically due north from the Battery in Manhattan, and that's where the first Dutch settlers lived, and they built the wall at Wall Street, and real estate north of there was cheap, and so that's the way New York developed. It grew north, and basically around this old Indian trail and along the banks of the rivers. So I don't see anybody writing feverishly. I need to see there. Stephen is doing a marvelous job already. Susan, are you writing madly? She's backing off. Susan is new from New York. She's seen a million shows. Need to meet Susan. All right, thank you. Seriously, because you're going to be called upon to recite your list. And if you can do it in iambic pentameter, or if you can make it rhyme, that would also be very good. If you want to sing your list, you could sing your list. Because I don't know if I can talk that long. So I definitely need all the help I can get. But if you write down your favorites, it makes it easier for all of us. And especially those of you like me who are slowly losing a tiny bit of memory. It probably hasn't happened to you, but it is happening to me. And that will inspire the talk. Jews on Broadway. So if you have ever been on Broadway and you're Jewish, this is a talk about you. But I think it really is talking about theater. And if you have seen a bunch of Broadway shows, this is still a show about you. It's a grand tradition that the Jews have brought with the musical theater to the world. I mean, a musical theater may have been started somewhere else, but it's an American phenomenon, and the movie industry just blew it up bigger in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and up to West Side Story being done again. The first major Jewish influence on Broadway was in the 1860s and 70s. There was a fellow named Erlanger. First name of Erlanger was Abraham, and he was Jewish, and he was part of the theater syndicate. He and a group of 5 other guys put together a group of theaters and ended up owning 1,000 theaters across the United States. There were no TVs. A lot of people couldn't read. So if you wanted to see a play or hear some music or an opera, you went to one of their theaters. And Erlanger was a mean SOB, a tough businessman. That's why he was so successful. But he produced about 700 plays. Passed away on the Lusitania, maybe? No, that was Frohman. Frohman was one of his partners. Charles Frohman was also a great American theater man, one of the members of the syndicate. He produced a little show called Peter Pan, and not only in London, where he premiered it, but in New York. Ran a long time, kind of made James M. Barrie a worldwide hero. Okay, so there weren't that many Jews in the United States. The Jewish immigration was coming. What really started the musical in the United States was the Irish immigration. After the potato famine, the Irish came over here, and they were a pretty rollicking, singing, dancing, have a good time group. And they buoyed the popularity of musicals. They wrote a few musicals. There's a lot of famous Irish songs. And then along came three guys from Syracuse, the boys from Syracuse, not the musical. These fellows, their name was Schubart, and they were from Russia. And they, let's see, and their family immigrated from Russia. There were 8 children. By the time they got to the United States, 2 of them had passed away. By the way, anytime you want to ask a question, I don't guarantee I can answer the question, but maybe somebody else can. But if you want to write it down or you want to ask it, don't be shy. I'd be happy to have questions because they really help the program go forward. 3 Schubert brothers had to work. Their father passed away. They had to support their family, but they got interested in theater. And let's see, it was Sam. Anybody remember the name of the other 2 Schubert brothers? Okay, so they got interested in theater in Syracuse, and the syndicate controlled the theaters there. But they started a little theater, and it succeeded. They were very good promoters. They knew everybody in Syracuse, and then they bought a theater. And then they decided that they were going to go to New York City and try their hand. So Bernard, I think, was the elder. He came to New York City first in about 1899, 1900, followed by the middle brother Sam, and then the younger brother came along. So 1908, all 3 of them were there. They were starting to produce shows. They would rent a theater. They made some money. They leveraged their way. They bought a theater. But then they came under pressure from the syndicate. But about that time, Sam died in a terrible train accident in Pennsylvania. And Erlanger said very publicly that he wasn't going to honor any of his contracts with the Schuberts because he couldn't honor a contract with a dead man. And that didn't go very well with the remaining Schuberts. And so they set about destroying the syndicate. They did it by building their own syndicate. They ended up with 1,000 theaters by the end of the Roaring 20s. But along the way, Erlanger was very tough on all the producers and the actors, and they decided to form a union, which is now Actors Equity. And in about 1919, the theater was rollicking along in New York City, and the actors couldn't get a raise, and they all went on strike. And that was the beginning of the end of the syndicate. Schubert's, on the other hand, cooperated. And after about 10 years, the syndicate was no more, and the leaders had passed on, and Schubert's took over many of their theaters. At one time, there were about 100 theaters in New York City, 500 seats or more, which is the standard for a Broadway house. You have to be more than 500 seats. And Schubert's owned, I think, about 39 of them. At any rate, in 1929 was a crash, and everything went to heck in a handbasket. So the Schuberts were advised to sell their theaters and to get out of the theater business. And they took that advice and threw it down the crapper. And instead, they started producing shows. And basically, they saved American theater, especially New York theater, in the 1930s during the Depression. And we got through to the war. Business picked up a little bit. More people were traveling, et cetera. A lot of money being spent by the government. And then we got to the golden age of American musical theater. Let's see what else. Who's got some old ones on their list? Who's raise hands. How many people have written something down? That's good. That's great. All right. Who wants to go? Stephen, you are the first writer. Can you give us a few names that you love in theater, please? Chorus Line, Les Mis, La Mancha, West Side, Evita, Oklahoma, Hamilton. Anybody agree with that list? Everybody agrees. I got another list here. What is your name, please? Malaga. Phantom. Yeah. Porgy.
The King and I, Steamboat, The Elephant Men, Cabaret, Sweeney Todd.
What's the last one?
Sweeney Todd.
Sweeney Todd, Sondheim. Very good. Sir. Inge.
And I forgot the others, but there was about 5 or 6 that they were very successful. Were they Jewish, Rodgers and Hammerstein?
Rodgers was Jewish and used to write with Lorenz Hart. Lorenz Hart passed away in the early 40s. Hammerstein father built a theater at 42nd Street in the 1890s. It was the first theater at 42nd Street. The mayor, 40, 50 years previously, had invited all the theater producers to come north and to build in this cheap area called, I think it was called Thieves Park at that point. It was outside of town. It was in the suburbs. And oh yeah, well, I'm answering the question. I have an editor over here, by the way. This is my beautiful wife, Sandy, a Jewish Broadway producer, by the way. But Hammerstein II was sort of raised as a Protestant, however, definitely Jewish. So let's see. Yeah, so Hammerstein II was there on Showboat, as this young lady brought up. I think she called it Steamboat, but that's all right. And that show, Showboat, was the very first genuine article Broadway musical. So it integrated the lyrics, the song, the theme, the stars. Old Man River was in fact a between the acts song. I can sing a few bars if you don't know. And because of that, Jerome Kern, who wrote with Hammerstein II at that time, sort of became the father of the American musical. And so when you're talking about a musical, what do people remember? What do they think? What do they do? It's like an opera. You walk out of the theater singing La Donna Mobile because it's such a great song. And that's how musicals endure. It's the music. Remember that, Jim. Okay, so yeah, Kern wrote 700 songs, perhaps 70 scores for theater and movies, and in fact, well, I'll tell that story a little later when we get there. So at any rate, we're in the 30s, and there are big production shows, sort of Busby Berkeley type shows, except they were on Broadway. Ziegfeld was an early producer, but he was a Lutheran, wasn't a Jew. So and he worked with Erlinger, he worked with the Syndicate, but eventually the Schuberts bought all those theaters. So end of the 30s, Hart dies. Kern has been hired to write Annie Gets Your Gun with his partner, Dorothy Fields. And he started work on the show in New York and has a stroke. He was not a young man, and went in the hospital and never came out. So the producer, by this time, was Hammerstein II. And he went to Irving Berlin, and he said, Irv, would you please write the music for this show about Annie Oakley? And he said, no, I won't do it. Not interested. I don't think I could write a musical to somebody else's book or lyrics. So Dorothy said, look, I withdraw. I'll work on the book, but you write the lyrics. And Irv said, no, not interested, won't do it. So Hammerstein said, well, look, why don't you just take it home and read it? And so he did. And he came back 4 days later with, You Can't Get a Man with a Gun. He came back with 3 other hits from that show. And of course, it became one of the great juggernauts for Ethel Merman. Ethel before then was not as considered as a serious an actress and singer. She did a lot of work with comedy, and but that show really brought everything home for everyone. And I think that was produced in about 1949 or 50. So I jumped ahead a little bit there, but you asked about Jerome Kern and Showboat. Let's see what else. Another list. We have another list. Fiddler. Cats. Lion King. JC. Hello, Dolly. And notice, what? We haven't forgotten Hamilton. But Hamilton was not, well, actually Hamilton was raised Jewish, but the show is not a very Jewish show. Anyway, Hamilton had a Jewish upbringing on the islands when he was a kid. Yeah. Anyway, so I was going to consult my notes while you were reading that list, and I got lost. All right, let's see. Howard, you're next. Yiddish theater. Let's go back to Yiddish theater. Yiddish theater, the official Yiddish theater started in Eastern Europe in 1876. And it started up, and it packed up and it moved to New York City. In 1882, they produced their first show in New York City. And let's see. In 1906, they did their first Broadway show. It was Kreitzer's Sonata, which is based on a Beethoven violin work. It was written by a guy you may never heard of, but his name was Gordon, Gordin. Gordon wrote 32 plays, about almost as many as Shakespeare. And his first show was produced with the Jewish Theater in 1882, when the Yiddish Yiddish theater started there. So it only took them 24 years to get to Broadway, but they did it. And then there started to be a lot of crossover. There were a lot of young Jewish immigrants, and they landed in New York City. They went to they saw the Statue of Liberty. They went got their papers and changed their names and moved into the Bronx and Brooklyn, a few into Manhattan. All of the let's see, all the Marx brothers grew up there. Minnie's boys. Who else? I want to say Kern. Yeah, Kern was born in New York. Jerome Kern was born on Sutton Place, which is a very, very fancy address in New York City today. You can get a co-op there for $6 million on a good day. However, when he was born there, it was where the brewery was. And it was close to the river. They got water. You wouldn't want to take water out of the East River anymore, but by God, they took water there and they made beer. So what else? What are you all watching? The Vasa. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I did. Really? Damn. I'm impressed. I have to watch what I write. Howard, I said you were next. You got a list for me? No,
I don't.
No list. I got one over here. Another Howard.
There's one over here.
Yes. Right. Yes, as a matter of fact, the Tomaszewskis did a show of Gordon's in 1885. It was like the third show that was done by the Yiddish theater in the United States, and many, many shows after that. Tomaszewskis were a dynamite couple.
You want my list?
Sure. Who
Okay.
said that? Who said that?
Right here.
What is your name right here?
I'm Carolita.
Hi, Carolita.
Hi. Guys and Dolls. Has somebody mentioned that?
Yeah.
Okay. South Pacific, My Fair Lady, Camelot, The Producers, and Beautiful. The Carol King
Carol
story.
King. You like that? Let's see. Go over that list one more time. I want to hear a name in there.
Guys and Dolls.
Guys and Dolls. That's what I wanted to hear.
Okay.
Who was the leading man in Guys and Dolls on Broadway? And who is his son?
I have no idea.
Who?
Robert Alder.
Robert
And
Alda.
his son is Alan Alda.
That's right.
Really?
Let's see. Okay. Sinatra was in the movie. He's not Jewish. All right. Okay, we did Gordon. Excuse me. Yeah, again. Don't get old. Don't get old. Yiddish theater. Okay. Kreutzer Sonata, 1906. Yiddish theater produced Kreutzer Sonata first in 1902. It's actually quite an important piece. It ran 29 shows at the Manhattan Theater in the summer of 06, and then it transferred to a different theater that I apparently did not write down, and ran 20 performances. That's a very respectable 50 performances for the first run of the Kreutzer Sonata. All right. Some of the shows produced by Erlanger: Dracula, Ben-Hur, The Jazz Singer. Okay. Froman produced 700 shows, not Erlanger. I got that wrong. And Froman died on the Lusitania in 1915. Okay. Kern was a Czech, by the way. Obviously an American, but all right, let's see. How am I doing for time? Plenty of time. Well, that's terrible. I can dance. So now we got to as far as about 1950. We got to 1950 with Annie Get Your Gun. Any other shows, really important shows from before then? Porgy and Bess. Yes, that's a pretty important show. We were discussing the beginning of it all. Well, Porgy and Bess is kind of operatic, don't you think? I mean, the musical is a slightly different flavor, and Porgy and Bess is a huge show to mount. It's very great. First totally American music on Broadway. You're off by 100 years. There were a couple of huge musical extravaganzas. The theater district in New York, theater started in the 1750s in New York. There were a couple of companies who wanted to do Shakespeare, and they did. But in 1750, New York was way the heck. This is before the war. It's before the Revolutionary War. New York City was a tiny village at the south end of Manhattan Island. In the 1820s or so, there were beer gardens at the foot of Broadway, and they became theaters. One of the first shows to play in the converted beer garden at Prince Street and Broadway was The Spy, a novel by James Fenimore Cooper, which was the first great American historical novel. And it also was the first American novel that crossed over to Europe and became popular in Europe. Benjamin Franklin and the Revolution and so many events happening in the United States created a sort of a revolution in Europe. The French Revolution came after our revolution. But America's influence, especially from Franklin, as a scientist and a statesman, as a philosopher and publisher, really grew after he served as an ambassador to France during the Revolutionary War. And then, but The Spy was interesting because it had George Washington, it had a lot of pretty girls and soldiers, it had a war, and a master counter spy who was sort of a Shakespearean Jewish character. His name was Harvey Birch, as I recall. And The Spy is one of the very few novels that has lyrics in it. There are 4 lyrics in The Spy. I'm not going to sing for you. I couldn't, but I know them. Anywho, so you could say that was the first musical, except I think there was an extravaganza even before the 1820s in Manhattan. That was a musical show. Now I can't say that it was all American, but I can say The Spy was all American. And The Spy was a story told by Chief Justice John Jay, our first Chief Justice. And Cooper wrote 42 books. He wrote 40 novels and 2 histories, and there's lyrics in only one of the others, and it's a song sung by Natty Bumppo, I think, in The Last of the Mohicans or The Pathfinder, The Deerslayer. Anywho, going back to Porgy and Bess. It ain't necessarily so. Does anyone know where that comes from? My wife was teaching me this morning. It's Baruch Atah Adonai. It ain't necessarily so. Minor key, descending notes, pathos. A lot of the great music came into the theater because of these Jewish immigrants and because of Jews like the Froman and the Schuberts, who took their money and started producing shows, came out of the service. You go ahead.
The melody is Barchuas Adonai Hambo Roch.
Okay.
Ain't necessarily so.
Yeah. It's the meter. The meter and the melody the meter is exact. The melody is quite close. And the fact that it's in a descending minor key is a clincher. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that I'm trying to think. So save that for the next lecture 5 years from now. I'm sure you'll all be here. I will. I hope. Yeah. So Porgy and Bess. A lot of credit is given to Ira Gershwin for writing lyrics to Porgy and Bess, but it was actually one of their other collaborators, another nice Jewish boy, whose name escapes me right now, wrote most of those lyrics, and of course the great music of George Gershwin. Another list. Who's got a list? Please, Bobby. Funny Girl. I've heard of that. Yeah.
Hair.
Hair.
Grease.
Grease. Hair is Jewish. Go ahead.
The Bronx Tale.
I don't know the Bronx Tale very well.
Chaz Palminteri one-man show.
I see.
In the Heights.
Sounds Italian. In the Heights.
Producers.
Yes. The producers, of course.
On the 20th Century.
On the 20th Century.
And then names. Lin-Manuel Miranda. Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Webber's an agnostic.
Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick.
Yes, yes. We worked with Matthew on nice work if you can get it. A really nice guy and a great wife. We danced with them even. Let's think. It's very nice being a producer because you get to meet a lot of stars. I produced my first show in New York in 1971. I was a junior in college back from Vietnam. And at the time, I knew nobody, but my roommates came up with this idea for a family entertainment. And half of them were Jewish. I was going to Montclair College in Upper Montclair, New Jersey. And so we produced it at Willowbrook Mall, which was 5 miles down the road from us on Highway 46 and near Route 3. And I guess it's in, I don't know. Anywho, we got great reviews. People came out and reviewed the darn show. And so the Bergen Record and the Newark, what's the name of the Newark paper? Anywho, we had some friends who had graduated the year prior. We were all juniors in college. And they said, we have joined up with a little theater in Manhattan. And if you'd like to rent it for the summer, we'll make you a great deal. So the other two fellows who were producing with me, Tony Giarmo and I don't remember. We each put up $333.34, and we rented a theater on weekends for the summer of '71, and we ran 2 shows, four shows a weekend. And we got excellent reviews in the little press. We couldn't even touch the Times, but we got into, the New Yorker, and we got into New York Magazine. They listed us, and this is a great show for families. And so that was a huge feather in our caps. There were about 10 of us, and I was the stage manager and co-producer, and I had a walk-on part as well. In this theater smaller than this room. I think we probably lost a few $100s over the course of a whole summer. It was a terrific experience. And we went back to college, and we were all heroes because we had been working in New York City. And at the end of the summer, the owners came back from Miami, where they had been working, and said, would you like to convert this into a regular off-Broadway show? And we said, yeah, that sounds great. How do we do that? And they described the process of taking it down to the village and sprucing it up and adding this and changing that. And then we realized, well, we'd stolen a lot of this material. We had McCartney songs, and we had a soundtrack from Yellow Submarine, and we had, so we said, do we want to go back to college, or do we want to get in a lawsuit? And we said, well, our parents would prefer if we went back to college. So we all went back and got our degrees. But that was a great experience. What else? Oh, Hayward, that's right. Du Bois Hayward was a partner of Ira Gershwin in writing the lyrics for Porgy and Bess. And he was quite brilliant. Ira's lyrics are less serious, more pop. Hayward really got gutsy and got into the soul of the South Carolina islands there, and did a marvelous job. All right, I want everybody to raise your hands, clap your hands. Okay, just making sure you're awake. Just making sure you're awake. She's asleep. Okay. Please. Stephen Sondheim. Stephen Sondheim. No, yeah, I don't think we can have him in this room at all. Yeah, I met Steve at Southern Methodist University in 40 years ago, 35 years ago, more or less. And at the time, I wasn't terribly impressed by him. And then I heard him talk, and then I got to dance with his friend Bernadette. And after that, I became a huge fan. We were Facebook friends, as a matter of fact. Yeah, in the 60s, New York theater started going downhill because New York sort of became the red light. Times Square kind of became the red light district. If you wanted to see naked women and you wanted to go to a XXX movie, you went to Times Square, and it started to drive away the theater crowd. And TV was in its heyday, and the movies were doing fine, although they were afraid of TV. And so along came the Shuberts. And Schubert said, it's time to put more money into Broadway. What happened at the end of the 30s, after the Shuberts had saved American theater in New York, they got a big antitrust suit. And they owned 1,000 theaters. They'd taken over many of them from the syndicate, and they owned 39 or 40 Broadway theaters. At that time, the number of 500-seat theaters in New York had gone from 100 down to 60. And so their reward for saving American theater in the 30s was an antitrust lawsuit, and they had to divest half of their properties. Today they own 17 Broadway theaters and 6 off-Broadway stages, and a number of theaters across the nation, big theaters. The Niederlander organization bought many of their theaters, another nice Jewish family. And there's another company called Jujamcyn, which has 5 or 6. And in fact, they announced a merger recently with another firm. They're going to get up to 7 or 8 Broadway theaters. They're not Jewish, but they're from Michigan, so they don't count. Let's see. I lost my train of thought. Where was I, Jim? Okay. I asked you to write them down and put them on your list, didn't I? Fanny Bryce, Danny Kaye, Al Jolson, all the Marx Brothers, Bob Hope. Bob Hope, yeah. Bob Hope became famous in shows produced by the Schuberts. In each decade or each score of years, you can come up with a list of 30, 40 wonderful stars that came out of the shows produced in New York. But we were about to talk about Sondheim. So the Sondheim came along and he made friends with Harold Prince after a couple of shows. I mean, Sondheim did the lyrics for West Side Story, with a guy named Lenny, and Arthur Lawrence, and the whole thing, I think, was who was the choreographer? Fosse, Robbins, and Robbins directed it, and so it was Romeo and Juliet put to dance outside of ballet. So, and then he did the lyrics for Mame with Ethel Merman. And so he started to get the attention of the big guys. And there was a young producer director named Harold Prince. And he and Harold Prince teamed up to do 4 or 5 shows in that period of 60s, 70s, 80s. And the city of New York got involved. And of course, the Schuberts were putting money into a lot of shows, as was Rodgers and Hammerstein's organization. After Oklahoma, both Hammerstein and Rodgers were well-made men. They had had many hits on Broadway separately, and now they were writing together, and these golden shows were brilliant. And so they started producing as well. That's why Hammerstein was one of the producers on Annie Get Your Gun. And so people would come to them with an idea, people they knew or liked or trusted or were talented, and they'd bloody well develop the show. They would try to produce it. And so they produced many shows in addition to their own. Often they use a different producer for their own shows, but that's just smart. It's like an attorney not going to court and defending himself. Better to have somebody else defend you. So there are now many producers on the show. When you're trying to raise $20 million to do a musical because of all the unions and all the rents and all the costs, and the price of advertising in New York is through the roof, then you need many people out there raising money. So generally, the rule of thumb is you raise $250,000 and your name is added to the list of producers. Now, if you invest, you can invest as little as $5,000. Normally, a share is $25,000. And you can become a partner in a Broadway show. But raise $250,000, then your name goes above the line, and that's how I got to be a producer. I produced. Sandy and I were partners in the revival of La Cage aux Folles. Yes, La Cage with Kelsey Grammer, and we won Best Revival. We won Best Director, Best Actor. Doug Hodge, the English actor, and made friends with all these people, including the people who actually were the lead producers on the show, Barry Weissler and Fran, his wife. And then he had this show called The Scottsboro Boys. And it's a very controversial show. They did it off Broadway. It was written by Kander and Ebb. Ebb passed away, and then Susan Stroman, who's a marvelous director and choreographer, had worked with them on developing the show. She has a small piece of ownership, and of course the writer of the show, another wonderful guy, who we spent a lot of time with in London. So I raised some money for that show, and and then they opened and they said, we need more money because the reviews are so good. The reviews were brilliant for the Scottsboro Boys. Now, some of you have never heard of the Scottsboro Boys, but some of you know as a historical thing. Anybody ever heard of the Scottsboro Boys? Okay, so a smattering. Scottsboro Boys were a group of Black guys who hopped a freight in Chattanooga in 1933 and got arrested. They stopped the train and they arrested all the hobos on the train. And there were two hookers on the train, two white hookers, and they accused the Black boys of raping them. That way, the hookers didn't get charged for vagrancy or hooking or whatever. And all the Black boys went to jail in Alabama and stayed there for many, many years until a famous civil rights lawyer, a nice Jewish boy from New York, came down and managed to get a few of them out. They spent many, many years locked up. They went to trial 3 or 4 times. And each time, the lawyer argued the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And there were several, like jury of your peers. It became the law of the land at that time. A right to representation by an attorney, a right to choose your attorney, et cetera, and so forth. A right to a speedy trial. All these things came up as a result of this case. And Kander and Ebb, who had written Kiss of the Spider Woman and Cabaret and Chicago and that wonderful Judy Garland show, what was that called? Anywho, they wrote New York, New York. And they decided they wanted to do a show based on the Scottsboro Boys. And I read the script. I read the script here, 13 years ago. And I said, I got to help produce this show. And I went out and we raised $250,000 and I put it in the show. Fortunately, part of it was a loan. We loaned some money to the show for advertising when it opened. And so we were made whole. We made all our money back. But the show was boycotted because there was a Black history expert in Harlem whose best friend was the publisher of the Harlem News. And they published a lot of anti-Scottsboro Boys stories because they didn't use this historian when they created the show. So at Thanksgiving of that year, they organized boycotts around the box office. And a lot of people wouldn't cross that line, So the receipts from the show started to go downhill instead of uphill. And they closed the show. But we then produced it in London 5 years later and won Best Musical. Anywho, it did play in San Francisco in about 2016, before the fires. Maybe even before that, 2014, yeah. And it played San Diego, went to Minnesota, went to Philly, played Boston recently. So maybe it'll get back. But they did it in the form of a minstrel show. And so a number of Blacks found that objectionable as well. And well, yes, there was only one white person in the show, so right. Well, and Black minstrel was a thing. No, they were Blacks, but yeah. So Black minstrel is a great American tradition. There were Black minstrel shows as well as white minstrel shows. It's not a new thing, but it was an opportunistic thing to get publicity for this Harlem authority on the Scottsboro Boys. At any rate, what else? We were going to talk about Sondheim. Yeah. So go ahead, young lady. Anything that Jerry Herman did. That's a famous show. Have anyone seen anything that Jerry Herman did? So, yeah. So tell us a few of those titles. Yes. Ah, I see. Ah. True, tickets are very expensive.
Going to be for $200. My husband almost had a canary, but that would be $200. And when I moved to Oakmont 22 years ago, the last show I saw on Broadway was The Producers, and that was $100.
Yeah.
And I thought, he almost had that was really terrible. But I'm sure so many had wonderful feelings about Broadway and how wonderful. And one of the best things about Broadway is when you grew up in New York, it was like New York and the rest of the country. That's the way everybody thought about it, which is terrible. And I admit that that's a terrible thing. There was a wonderful poster, and it had, that had the 5 boroughs of New York, and then there was the rest of the world to
That's
the
right.
Pacific Ocean. If you
Yeah,
all
New
remember
Yorker
that.
put it on a cover, right?
But so we all went to the theater, and next week, through the Friendship Circle, through the Jewish Community Center, we're going to see Tina Turner. Yeah. So the point is that because of Broadway, it went all over the world. And we're with a friend, Jean, and she's from San Francisco. And I'm sure when you were growing up, you went to the city and we all got dressed up and we all wore gloves, and it was a wonderful experience. And when you talk about the city here, you talk about San Francisco. In New York, it was Manhattan. But so it's come full circle. So thank you to Broadway, that it's come all around the country and that everybody can experience them. And they keep doing revivals because they're the only ones that seem to be making money.
Well,
Always been
revivals.
successful, but there's a few good shows. New shows.
What works well is to revive a show and then put it on the road. The road shows make more money initially than Broadway shows. Broadway is so expensive, as you say, and tickets are very high. But once you have built the sets and cast the show, and it has some cachet, then you can put it on the road. You have the sets, and you can put them on a truck, you get the cast, you put it on a bus, and it's a heck of a lot less expensive than putting up stars in New York City. And so touring shows make a lot of money. Hamilton, which you've all praised, which I love, Hamilton didn't make money in New York City for 3 years. 3 years for the break even in New York City. They put it in a 1,200 seat theater. They weren't sure if it was going to work at all. They moved it up from the public theater on Astor Place, and where everyone was acclaiming it, but they didn't know. So, but the tour, they started the tour a year later. The tour made money right away. And there were 3 companies. And then there was a permanent residency of Hamilton in San Francisco and in Chicago and in Denver, et cetera. There were, so that's just an interesting phenomenon. But you can go to see shows in San Francisco, and you can get discounts. A smart thing New Yorkers do now is they get tickets to the previews. They get their favorite seats for the previews. They don't cost 138 or 164 or what, 200. Now for Hamilton, if you wanted a really good seat to Hamilton, you could go to the box office, and for $138.75, you could buy a seat for a year from now. But if you wanted to see the show in 6 weeks or 6 months, you had to pay $500 or $1,000. And some people paid more. And if you had a family of 6 and it's somebody's birthday, then you're out $3,000 before parking. So, and parking is pretty high. Yes, Susan. Paul Simon. No, John. Neil Simon. Plaza Suite. everything else. 20 plays, starting with Barefoot in the Park. And he rewrote Barefoot in the Park 36 times before he got it produced. And since then he's written. Is that right? I haven't read that. I see. So here, wait, Susan.
Okay, I was just bringing up a Jewish name in theater, more contemporary. I know him as Doc, but Neil Simon. I mean, he wrote, and all his plays were Jewish plays. They were all biographies, autobiographies of his wife, of his life, and stories about being a Jewish guy in the army, and Biloxi Blues, and Brighton Beach Memoirs, and all those shows were Jewish stories of his life. And, he owned a theater, and he worked with the Nederlanders and many other people. But yeah, and Ethel Merman wasn't Jewish, if anyone thought she was. Even though her name is Zimmerman, she wasn't Jewish, but very nice lady.
A nice Dutch girl. Okay, so yeah, Neil Simon plays. Any other playwrights come to mind? Jewish playwrights. Nothing's hitting me over the head.
Since you're a playwright and we've been seeing the Vasa up there all this time, why don't you tell us what you're doing with the Vasa and how it sank, etc.?
Okay. So 40 years ago, I was dating Peppermint Patty, who was playing in You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, written by a local, Charles Schultz. His dog's statue is outside. And her father, who was a congressman from Pennsylvania, where I was born, came back from his second honeymoon, and he had gone to Stockholm, to Sweden. And we took him to lunch at the plaza, and he sat there and talked to us for a half an hour about the Vasa ship. The Vasa ship was built in 1626 to 8, as Howard said. And it was the biggest ship that had ever been built at that time. It was a warship. And halfway through the construction, the king said, I need an extra row of cannons. He was trying to control the Baltic, and people were trying to control Sweden. And so they put in a lower deck of cannon. So the ship, instead of having 40 cannon, had 72 20-pounders. I mean, these cannons could shoot a 20-pound ball. And so when the ship went out on day one, it sank. I put up only 3 sails out of the 10, and it got a little bit of wind, and it went straight down to the bottom of Stockholm Harbor. And some of the cannon recovered, but 330 years later, a retired naval architect, a guy named Franzen, found the sucker in 100 feet of water, covered in mud, and it started a campaign to raise it because it was perfectly preserved. The ship is about 90 some odd percent just the way it was when it sank, minus the masts. And it's beautiful. It's now a gorgeous museum in Stockholm. It's the #1 museum in Stockholm. People all over Europe go there, millions of people per year. And so Congressman Johnson said, you kids have to write a play about this ship. And we said, this is a story about a ship that went 100 yards and sank and killed a bunch of people, and you think it's a play? So I turned over a napkin and I wrote a scenario, a love story about a couple in Stockholm in the 50s. He's getting out of the Navy. He's a frogman. He's a scuba diver. And she's a singer. So we have lots of music. And when the ship is discovered, they're in love. He's getting out of the Navy. They're going to start a family. They're going to get careers and all this jazz. They're late teens, early 20s. And he goes back in the Navy to join and become a hard hat diver, a deep sea diver, to help in the recovery of this ship. And so in order to do so, he has to rejoin the Navy. He has to leave his girlfriend. She's in the suburbs. He's down in the Navy Yard. And on weekends, he's scuba diving to recover artifacts from near the ship because there's all these artifacts. Anywho, she goes to his parents and says, "What the hell is wrong with your son?" And they tell her the story of his great grandfather who died on the ship 330 years prior. And so we go back to Dalarna, which is the sort of the soul of Sweden, the folk dance, the folk music, the folk culture. It's the part of Sweden that turned Sweden around after the Danes killed everybody. And he's a woodsman, he's a sailor on a huge lake called Lake Siljan, and he's in love with a pretty girl. And we go through their courtship and their marriage. And they move to Stockholm so he can join this ship that he's been cutting wood for. And he dies on the ship. And it's a huge operatic end of Act 2. He comes back as a ghost and he sings to his wife, "He was born to the sea." That's the name of the show, Born to the Sea. He was born to the sea. He was destined to serve on the water. Anywho, Act 3, she goes back to him. The singer goes back to her diver husband or boyfriend and says, "I love you. No matter what happens, it's all cool. Don't worry." What he doesn't know is, in the meantime, she's had his child. So he's down there under the ship. He gets trapped. He thinks he's going to die. This actually happened. Not to this guy, another guy. But, and he ends up in the hospital. And she comes in and nurses him a little bit. And then they go through another experience where he's diving. He recovers from this event. They're starting to raise the ship. And he gets to go back in the hospital. She comes and she bolsters him a little bit. And by that time, he's found out that he has a son. And I can't tell you the ending, but it's happy. Anyway, so that's what I'm writing. I have 2 or 3 partners. Sandy is helping me as well. A lot of research. And we just came back from Sweden. I spent 3 weeks there researching and meeting people, and they love it. So it looks like we'll get it produced in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. I was telling Howard, the gestation period for a Broadway musical is about 8 years, average. So it takes 8 years to get the idea, get it on paper, get the music, get a reading, get a tiny production, get a larger production a year later, raise some money, so on and so forth. At the end of 8 years, if you have spent $500,000, it should be ready for Broadway. If at the end of 8 years you spend $500,000 and it's not ready for Broadway, it never will be. And that's how it works. And some shows take longer, and sometimes are shorter. This show, I mean, I wrote the bare bones for this 40 years ago, and it's been in a trunk. I kept reading about it as they turned it from a wreck, a hulk. They got it to float. They put it inside a building. Then they found out it was starting to decay. It was buried in the mud and garbage from Stockholm for 300 and some odd years, and that preserved it. That and the fact that the little animals that normally eat shipwrecks couldn't survive because there's not very much salt in Stockholm Harbor. It's part of a freshwater lake system, and they have. It's the only city I've ever seen where they have locks between the east side of the city and the west side of the city, which is the entrance to the Baltic. Anyway, it's a lot of fun, and it's a hell of a lot of work, and it's a labor of love, and that's the way it is with theater. Please. So that's a model of the ship.
Holes in
The
it.
one in the museum.
The one in the museum is whole. There are several recreations of the ship in the museum. They're large, medium, and small. And the medium and the small ones, they've cut away so you can actually see what went on in all these compartments in the ship. The ship itself is whole. It's 300 feet long. It's 150 feet high. It's gorgeous. It was the pride of the Swedish nation when it sank. So they had painted it and gilded it, and flags flying, and they had Roman emperor busts carved on the front of the ship and all this stuff. It's quite amazing. Very interesting story and a fascinating museum, sir. Yes, the best one ever. Yes, it was a magnificent. So South Pacific to me is the best. Act one is a lot of opera. It feels like opera. I mean, he's singing One Enchanted Evening in this crowded room of people. No one can hear him, and she's over there. It just knocks me out, no question. Best, my favorite. Go ahead. Sure. Right. Plays. It depends on how smart you are when you do them. Yeah. So I'm sure that some of Mamet's plays have made money. The trick is you get 1 star, you get a strong supporting cast of players, you go into a small enough theater. If you can, you transfer the show in from somewhere else so that you're not paying extremely high prices for everything to be built. And so it might come from New Haven, it might come from Chicago, it might come from Cincinnati or Detroit. A lot of shows came out of Detroit in their day. Yeah. So, and if it runs for a year or 9 months, it could break even. It could make money. But some of Mamet's shows have become movies, and sometimes the producers get some of that money. How are we doing, Howard?
I think we're starting to run out of time.
Okay.
And I want to thank you very much for doing this great presentation on the Jews on Broadway.
Thank you.
I think there's a lot of interest from what you can see. And I don't know, you have another talk you can give us sometime?
Someday, yeah, sure.
Great. Or maybe have the play come to Oakmont.
Well, we actually did a reading. We did a reading of a play here about 10 years ago, a play called Blood Letters. Oh, nobody could stand it. So, but we produced it down in the Village as an off Broadway show.
Well, thank you very much. And let's have a big round of applause for Joe Black.